Hey everyone, Tim Muldoon back with day 18 of Ignatian mindfulness. And in this episode, I would like to really focus in on something which is very much at the heart of the Ignatian tradition. And here I think it's just important to recognize that, Ignatius of Loyola was somebody who was profoundly moved by an experience of injury and had time to really kind of go back inside his mind and look at his priorities. And what emerged after this long period of convalescence was a profound sense that God had created him for something, and that his life from that point on had to be about trying to discover what that purpose was. And of course, from that point on, he had remarkable experiences of prayer, of conversation with God that ultimately led him to the founding of the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits. So, this was a person who was profoundly moved by God. Now, in this series, I have been really trying to focus on mindfulness practices, which I have described in as many words as practices that, as it were, remove distractions and refocus ourselves on good things. And, to be sure, those are not the same thing as prayer, and I addressed that in an earlier episode. But in order to really get at a truly Ignatian perspective on mindfulness, we really have to come back to that question of who God is and how we encounter God. So really briefly, let me suggest it this way, that mindfulness practices help us to just remove the obstacles. So there's an ancient maxim in the monastic tradition, really, and I should say, just parenthetically, that Ignatius himself was influenced by that tradition. And in fact, at one point early on in his post-convalescent life, considered seriously entering a monastery and having a deep life of contemplative prayer for the rest of his life. Ultimately, God led him in a different direction. But the point is this: what I think he drew from that tradition, and what we ourselves can draw from that tradition, is that removing these obstacles can, as it were, make us more disposed to discern who God is. Now, here I'm speaking specifically to those of you maybe that aren't as easily given to practice of prayer, or maybe don't have a particularly strong religious background, okay? That's fine. Neither did Ignatius, and that's why I think he is certainly a saint for our time. He's, in some ways, the saint of the nothing era, the nones, N-O-N-E-S, because, he himself kind of grew up in this, generally, very religious culture of late medieval Spain, suffused with, Catholic symbolism and all the rest. But he was not a religious man. I mean, certainly not before this experience of having to be laid up in bed with this dramatic leg injury from a battle. So, he found his way to God. And I think that the way he did this was to get rid of the mess in his consciousness, in his mind. And what really focused him were two things. And one was a book about the lives of the saints, who really just inflamed him with this sense of what would it be to do great things, not for a king, but for the author of the universe, okay? And so that really changed his pattern of imagining. And then the other thing was really just a life of Christ. It was written by a famous medieval author, Ludolf of Saxony, and it just, again, changed his pattern of imagining to really encounter who Jesus was. So coming back to our time, to really talk about an Ignatian form of mindfulness is to talk about a form of mindfulness that certainly does give us peace of heart, maybe not as much kind of frenetic movement in our minds, in the busyness, in the anxiety, and the worry. So all those things are good. And I do think that these practices, many of which have ancient roots, they're fine. They're very good. And to the extent that we practice them, they can help us to, be able to think more clearly, to tune in to others, to prioritize the right things in our lives. But in the end, what these mindfulness practices are meant to do is, as I've suggested, clear away the junk and make us more disposed to hear the soft voice of God. And here I want to use a biblical image. It's from the story of the Old Testament prophet Elijah, and he's in this cave and waiting for God, and there's this there are these series of loud distractions, and one gets the sense that, oh, surely Elijah will hear God speaking in thunder and earthquakes, and instead God appears to Elijah in this what's described as a tiny whispering sound, and Elijah just covers his face and goes to stand before the Lord. And this to me is just a wonderful metaphor for the way that God shows up in our lives. We want to see God show up in the, aha, here's the great thing. Aha, here's the fantastic political change. Aha, here's the world-changing event that shakes me out of my stupor. It's not usually that way. I mean, even in a story like that of St. Paul, who is, as the story goes in the Acts of the Apostles, knocked off his horse and, hears this voice from Jesus saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" That's the exception. I mean, if you read through Christian history, that's the exception. Usually, the way that people come to God is much more quiet, and it's much more almost the fruit of becoming a little bit more focused. So I'm going to read this theme of Ignatian mindfulness as a way of eliminating distractions and being able to tune in, to focus on that soft voice of God. And what might it look like? Well, I think one clue, and I'll unpack this in later episodes, but one clue is, does it generate in me greater love? Does it generate in me greater capacity to serve others, greater generosity? That's a test of whether, for Ignatius, it comes from God. And we'll get to his rules for discernment another time. But Ignatius, remember, is somebody whose life and really whose writing and everything that he did was so focused on this theme of discernment. And that's a technical word. That's an insider's word. And I'll be very clear. Discernment means to carefully pick apart. This is good. This is bad. This is the voice of anxiety. This is the voice, the soft voice of God. So truly speaking, most kind of, in a most focused way, Ignatian mindfulness is a mindfulness of the way that God's voice, kind of softly sometimes, moves our hearts in the direction of greater love. So today, maybe the question you might ask yourself is, where have I sensed, where have I discerned the voice of God? And again, if that language for you is still a little foreign, ask yourself, where have I sensed movements in me that are moving me towards generosity, are moving me towards self-giving, are moving me in the direction of desiring less of the things that kind of tug at me and gnaw at me, and more in the direction of how does this benefit other people, particularly vulnerable people, poor people, people on the margins, people that don't have others to care for them. And certainly in the midst of this pandemic, we can still be asking that question. Everything that we're being, told, even from our public health officials, is be mindful of those most vulnerable. Be aware of the elderly. Be aware of those in homeless shelters or in other high, contact places where the spread of disease can happen. Be aware of those who are sick and those that are serving the sick. That is the kind of mindfulness that disposes us to discern the soft voice of God. So, some thoughts for the day. There's plenty more to unpack. I hope you'll join me next time. Have a good day.